So we come to James I. James's mother Mary became Queen of Scotland when she was only 6 days old. Her French mother acted as regent and ensured she married the Dauphin, who's the Crown Prince of France. However, he died when Mary was 18 and she returned to Scotland. There she recognised the Presbyterian Church, which had been championed by John Knox amongst others, and recognised that it would replace the Roman Catholic Church in the favour of many Scottish nobles, but she herself remained a Catholic. John Knox had been a Catholic priest, but he became disillusioned with the Church. He spent time in Geneva, and on his return to Scotland in 1559, at the request of the Scottish Protestant nobles, who had made a covenant with each other to reform the Church, and so they're known as the Covenanters, he suggested a form of church government in which Knox took the idea of representative government, characteristic of Calvin's Reformed churches, that's communities led by elected elders or presbyters, and applied it locally, regionally, and nationally, in a total reversal of the top-down or hierarchical fashion of Catholic or Episcopalian government. So the local councils, the presbyteries, the regional councils, the synods, and the national councils, the general assemblies that presided over the faithful, were made up of representatives not of political rulers over the church, but of the people themselves. In 1566, the tension of Protestant lords led by a Catholic queen became too much, and there was an uprising which ended in 1567 with Mary being forced to abdicate in favour of her son, James VI, who was then only a year old. And so the power of the nation was in the hands of his Protestant regent, Mary's half-brother, the Earl of Moray. Now, James VI had a strict Presbyterian upbringing, and when he was 37, he became King of England as James I. He reacted to the experience of his mother by asserting the sovereign's right was derived directly from God. And although he favoured the Episcopal Church, he was a realist and could see the strength of the Presbyterians in Scotland. He worked with a single chamber Scottish estate or parliament, and despite the Presbyterians' claim that ecclesiastical power was over that of the king, he managed to work with them. But when James became King of England, his lack of experience of working with a strong parliament caused problems. He wanted more money, and so he had to call Parliament to get it. But then when they wouldn't agree with him on things, he dissolved it. In fact, he laid the foundation for his son's downfall. But the greatest thing that James left the church was the King James version of the Bible. During Elizabeth's reign, a great number of English Bibles were produced with different amounts of accuracy. The Geneva Bible was in particular favour with the Puritans and was distrusted by James since it had an anti-royalist slant in its translation. Before she died, Parliament was already planning a definitive version, and this was an early project that King James took on. From 1604 to 1611, the best linguists of the day worked on this new Bible, which was to be retained as the official Bible of the English Church until the 20th century. James's son, Charles, had a high sense of his rights as king, and he favoured a high Anglican style with lots of ceremony. As King of Scotland, this was a clear problem, but it was also a cause of dispute in England. And then his marriage to Roman Catholic Henrietta Maria of France also caused problems. The French insisted on laws to remove all restrictions on Roman Catholics in England, and Charles agreed secretly to this, despite having assured Parliament to the contrary in 1624. He backed wars against France and Spain, despite his marriage, but then these weren't favoured by Parliament, probably because of the cost. But he needed Parliament to vote for taxes to fund his military campaigns. But whenever he called them up, they disagreed with him on what he was going to spend the money on. In 1629, he gave up the struggle and stopped calling Parliament for the next 11 years. He had to raise money by other means, and these were often unfair, including imposing ship money in the ports of his realm. He was supported in his activities by William Laud, who was Archbishop of Canterbury. And William Laud was an Arminianist, accepting that people could choose to become Christians, while the church was formally Calvinist, favouring predestination. He was also very much in favour of ceremony and religion. In 1637, Charles tried to impose the English prayer book and high church liturgy on the Scottish church, and this provoked riots in Edinburgh. He called a parliament in England in 1640 to get the money to fight the Scots, but this was quickly dissolved. It was known as the Short Parliament. But he still needed the money, so Parliament was recalled, and this time it was the Long Parliament, which insisted that it could not be dissolved without its own consent. The Irish rebelled in 1641, causing more tensions between the King and Parliament. And things finally broke down completely between King and Parliament in 1642, when Charles raised his royal standard and called on his loyal subjects to support him. His new capital was Oxford. The opponents of the king were in part rallied by the call for reform to the church, and Cromwell developed something called the New Model Army, which contained officers from dissenting groups. The country was split, with the north, the west, and the southwest broadly favouring the king, and London and the southeast siding with Parliament. But there were local variations, with neighbouring villages and towns on opposite sides. In 1646, Charles placed himself in the hands of the Scottish army. But he would not agree to bring the Church of England into Presbyterianism, and so they handed him over to the English Parliament. In 1648, the parliamentarians were falling out with each other over whether the church should be a national church with a Presbyterian structure or independent congregations. Charles used this disagreement to flee to Scotland, where he promised Presbyterianism for England in exchange for Scottish support. But Oliver Cromwell's army won this final stage of the Civil War. Charles was captured, was executed for high treason against the realm of England in January 1649. During the Civil War, the Long Parliament set up something called the Westminster Assembly of Divines. It had 150 members, including 30 members of Parliament, and members of all the Protestant groups except those who favoured Archbishop Laud. Theirs was the task of determining the future government of the Church of England, as well as producing a new creed for it. And the result of their work was the Westminster Confession of Faith in 1647. And this is the foundation document for Presbyterianism in England. So we come to the Commonwealth and the Protectorate between 1649 and 1660. Between 1649 and 1653, England was a republic called the Commonwealth, and it was ruled by the Rump Parliament. This was the members of the Long Parliament, but any who were doubtful about having had Charles executed were excluded. The Presbyterian system of church government, which had been disliked by the king for obvious reasons, was attractive to the new leaders of the Commonwealth. In 1646, during the war, it was agreed to by a significant part of the parliamentarian leaders. A small minority favoured Congregationalism. In 1650, the Act of Uniformity was repealed at the insistence of the army. However, while independent churches were tolerated, tithes were still paid by everyone, and the Catholics were definitely not tolerated. Famously, during this time, some laws were passed to enforce Puritan views. The Rump Parliament passed laws to close down theatres and to enforce a strict observance of Sunday. Saints' days were no longer to be observed, and Christmas, Easter, and Whitsun were banned as too raucous, too reminiscent of Roman ways. But the Commonwealth did not last, as Cromwell in 1653 assumed the title of Lord Protector and ruled as a military dictator. More Puritan legislation was enacted, including the banning of makeup and colourful clothes for women. In 1658, a group of Congregationalists convened to revise the Westminster Confession to allow for congregationalism. And this is the Savoy Declaration, which, if anything, is the founding document of congregationalism in this country. In 1658, Cromwell died and his son Richard assumed the protectorate. But he was unable to control the army, and he resigned in 1659. General Monk, who had been the governor of Scotland under Cromwell, ensured the return of Charles II. And the English experiment with republicanism and military dictatorship was over. Wonder what you think the impact of this period of history has had on us today, and what difference this had made to the church. And so we come to the Restoration. In the Declaration of Breda, the conditions under which Charles II would assume the throne were laid out. There would be an amnesty for all who had been his enemies, as long as they recognised Charles II as their lawful monarch. There would be religious toleration. The Church of England would become episcopal again, but the separatist churches were permitted to continue. From this time, they became known as nonconformists, since they refused to conform to the standard religion of the land. And Puritanism lost its sway with the passing of the Commonwealth. With a sigh of relief, the theatres reopened and people started to enjoy religion again. In 1662, a revised version of the prayer book was produced, and by an act of uniformity, it was imposed as the only book for use within the Church of England. The Convocations of York and Canterbury were asked to suggest revisions that they saw fit. The language of the book remained that of Cranmer, but the most obvious archaisms were exchanged for more contemporary words. Revisions came from both Puritans and the more Catholic wings of the Church. The latter had the commemoration of the faithful departed reinstated in the prayer for the Church militant, and the manual acts during communion prayer were restored. The Puritans got the black rubric reinstated, and the rubrics for the consuming of what was left over, so that the bread could not then be venerated.